I want to talk about a subject of people living in fake realities, artificial realities that they've created for themselves. You see, I've realized something. You don't have to have any external things to create, let's say, a fake reality for someone or for a society or for people. It all happens in the mind. That's where it starts. Everything else is nothing but a byproduct, an after effect of what goes on in the mind. And the reason why I want to bring this subject up is because I want to talk about the subject of success and how 90% of the people that you see that drive fancy cars and live in big houses and wear fancy clothes, and they all look like they're presenting themselves to be these ultra successful people. And many times, first of all, only 2% of people can actually afford to drive around in Range Rovers and Porsches and Lexuses and Mercedes and BMW. Most people that you see that drive on the road can't afford those cars. It's all a show. They are living in a fake reality that they have created in their minds for themselves. And what goes on in the real world, so to speak, that goes from their mind and translates into reality is the after effect. It's the after effect of what kind of bubble, what bubble they have put themselves in and what reality they're living in. And this ties along into shtf, shit hitting the fan, without rule of law. This ties into that subject because today I was thinking about shit hitting the fan. I was thinking about the normal things I usually think about, which is, am I prepared? What do I not know that I need to know now? What are my plans? What plans work for me? What plans might not work for me? Going through my daily thought patterns into preparing for an shtf situation, if something like that ever were to come. How would I better suit myself for the environment that I would be living in, the situations that would face me? And I started to think about people that live in fake realities. They create these inflated bubbles for themselves in their own minds that they're living a lie. They're living a delusion. It's like what we see with most, modern day women, of course, and how they want to impress each other, and how people in general try to one-up each other. And all they're doing is the fact that they are creating a bigger bubble than the next person's bubble in their own minds. They're trying to create an even more fake reality for themselves than the person next to them who lives in an already big, created, artificial bubble, fake reality that they're living in their own minds. Whether it's the chick that wants to have all the fancy clothes and the fancy purses, wants to live in the big house and all that crap, drive the fancy cars. All they want to do is create an even more fake reality for themselves than the next person. And regardless of however fake everybody's little world that they're living in is, we're all living in a giant, even a bigger, more vast than anybody could imagine, artificial reality, which we call the Matrix. And inside that Matrix, you have all these little. It's like, think of it like this: you have one giant big bubble, and in that giant big bubble, there's people in that bubble and in that giant bubble, there's even smaller bubbles within bubbles. And those would be the people living in their own little fake versions of what the giant bubble actually is, the Matrix. And it led me to shit hits the fan. And I thought to myself, this is why, especially in Mgtow, we destroy this notion of living in these fake realities that we once put ourselves in, these little bubbles of what we thought this world was and what we thought marriage and women were all about and all that other stuff. And we put ourselves in that bubble, and then our bubble popped one day. And it was probably the best thing that could ever happen to us. What happens when you pop someone's bubble? You destroy their reality of what they thought the world was, how they thought the world actually worked. Whatever they were told in the schools that began the growth, it was the air that created their bubble of living in this artificial reality that they live around. A lot of what the school institutions, not just a lot, it's all of them, start to generate this in our minds when we're very young. It all starts in the mind. You don't have to have fancy gizmos and virtual reality to create an artificial reality. It all starts in the mind. All of it starts in the mind because your thoughts eventually will translate into actions, depending on what those thoughts are and depending on what you do and how long you think about those thoughts. And if those thoughts grow and manifest strong enough, you'll do whatever you start to think. And so you look at people that drive and live fake lives. They live in they live in an alternate world of their own. They wear the fancy clothes, they buy the fancy cars, and they afford houses that probably they can't afford, or they screwed some people over to get to where they are, or they're not very moral people, so that they can live in their own little version of their own little reality. This comes into shtf. Could you imagine what would happen if there was actual real turmoil in this country to the point where we would have an shtf, a without rule of law situation? Could you imagine what would happen to those people who never prepared and they thought that their little reality, their little bubble could never pop? Could you imagine what would happen to them when that bubble popped? Do you think those people are going to be able to deal with the psychological and emotional turmoil of living in a shit hits the fan world and it will never go back to what you thought it was? This is why taking the red pill, the analogy that we used to say we took the red pill, is the biggest and most important life lesson I think we could ever have. And it translates way past women. This translates into the world that we actually live in. We popped our bubble when we took the red pill. And when we popped that bubble, we began to prepare for what the reality was. We started to adjust our minds to what reality really is. When we did that, at that point in time, we began to see the forest from the trees for the first time since we were young children. Since the first time this whole germination in our minds of being indoctrinated and brainwashed into all these different thought patterns, it began to wear off, and we began to see what all this was all about. As far as the people that are living in their realities, all these people, all these women, all these men, all these society, the general sheeple, who all they want to do is impress people just for the sake of getting one-upmanship, wanting to show off, wanting to have things they really can't afford, to show off and live a fake lifestyle that they're only presenting to live and inflate their bubble bigger than the next person who's already had an inflated bubble. They want to have a bigger fake reality than the next person. How ridiculous of a life is that? Because it's all fake. This whole world we live in is based on artificially inflated bubbles. And those bubbles pop. And we saw this with the dot-com crash. And we're seeing this now with the economy. We're seeing this now with politics. We're seeing all these bubbles begin to pop. It's like taking an animal who's been kept in a cage their whole life. In this case, it would be human beings and people living in their own delusional mindset, in their minds. Their mental, psychological bubble pops. It's like taking them and throwing them into a war zone, without any training, and more importantly, without the psychological, mental aptitude to handle such a life. These people will not make an shtf. And these are the people who are into prepping have to worry about. Because when you destroy someone's reality that they've created in their minds, thinking that they know how the world really works, when you pop that bubble, they turn into wild, dangerous animals. Because they've never been exposed to anything but living in their own delusion. And that's our world today. That's the matrix within the matrix. And all these bubbles are starting to pop. The feminist bubble popped in terms of the fact that we found out what it really was all about. When we decided to take the red pill and we found out it was all nothing but an agenda to destroy and hate men and destroy everything around them. We see this with the economy popping. We see this with politics and the SJWs and the censorship. All these bubbles are beginning to pop all around us, seeing them for what they really are. And that's why people in SHTF are so dangerous. Because when their mental bubble pops, when their reality that they've lived in, that they've created, and have, whether or not they screwed people over to have things that create their thought patterns and reinforce their thinking, when you sever that connection, people turn into wild animals because they weren't living in reality. When we took the red pill in Mgtow, when we used that analogy, basically when we popped our bubble in our minds, that was the greatest gift we ever could have gotten out of this. I'd choose knowledge over riches any day. These people would rather choose riches over knowledge. And so they inflate their bubble and they inflate their bubble and they keep getting bigger and bigger. They get the house, they get the car, they get the fancy bushes, the this, the that. And then one day, it pops. And most of those people will never be able to recover from that because it was such a blow, and the bigger the amount that they inflated their little reality that they created in their mind, living in a fake world that they have created in their psychology, the bigger that bubble gets, the louder the pop is going to be. It's like you inflate a balloon. The more you inflate it, the louder it's going to pop. And that's why these people, these sheeple that live in these artificially created realities, and people in general, when their bubbles pop, they're going to be very dangerous. And that's why you could be the greatest driver in the world, you could be the greatest prepper in the world, you could have all the fancy gizmos and gadgets and all this stuff in prepping, and then all this stuff, and then if you don't have the knowledge to be able to carry yourself through it, it doesn't matter. Because it's other people that you're going to have to watch out for. And there's a lot of people these days living in fake bubbles, fake artificial realities. It's only a matter of time before their bubbles start to pop. And we see it happening every single day. And that's why I say to people who, young men especially, and middle-aged men and older men, I shouldn't use those terms because this applies to everybody, every man. Every guy wants to have the fancy car and the fancy house and live in all that luxury. They want to have a Ferrari. They want to have all this. They want to have the pinnacle of what riches and wealth looks like. But when you live in a fake reality, when you create an artificial bubble in your own mind of what you think something is, you're not living in reality, when that bubble pops, all of that will be gone. Every last bit of it. Everything that you thought, that you created in your mind, will go away in a matter of a second. Civilization collapse happens. You think those people who live in, have cars and live lifestyles and live certain kind and say the right things and do the right things, you think they're going to be able to survive if shit hits the fan? The people that live in fake artificial worlds they create in their own minds, you think they're going to be able to survive such a thing? They're not. That's why you don't need to get caught up into the daily menundum of society, because it is nothing but artificially inflated bubbles waiting to pop. So anyways, that's all I wanted to say today, is that we have a bunch of people today who don't understand they're living in fake bubbles, and that these artificial worlds that people, and these delusions that people create for themselves, are nothing more than artificially inflated bubbles waiting to pop. And when you take the red pill, you get knowledge and your bubble pops. And it pops early on. And if you could pop it early on, it won't get to a point where it explodes. Because when it explodes, it's going to be much grander than what it was before you pop that bubble. So in other words, every bit of hardship that we go through, and everything that men go through in hardship in our society today, is preparing us for the reality of the situation that we live in. And it's showing us something. It's showing us that everybody has bubbles around them and they're waiting to pop. We don't want to be anywhere near those bubbles when they do. Because the real person is going to show themselves for what they are when their little bubble pops. We popped ours early on. We're preparing for the inevitable. We know that reality and having all the fancy cars and all that stuff, there's nothing wrong with having nice things, but in a world that's sick, in a world that's degrading, in a world that is immoral, and people are participating in completely devious acts and willing to go to great extents to inflate their bubble bigger than the next person, there's only one result that can lead to that, and that's the bubble popping. Get prepared.